Well, thank you, David, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. According to the Chancellor, Britain is booming. Unemployment is falling quickly. There are a record number of people in work. Strong growth. The sun is coming out. Britain is walking tall. And yet, after 5 years of austerity, we're still failing to significantly reduce the deficit. The difference between the income that the government receives and the expenditure which it undertakes. The Chancellor had set himself the goal of eliminating the deficit by the end of this Parliament, but now says it will take another 5 years of austerity. Much of the political conversation over the last 5 years has been on the subject. Much of the analysis of the budget over the last week has been from a deficit perspective, and we can be fairly confident that over the remaining 40, however many days it is, of the election campaign, how we deal with the deficit is going to be a key part of the campaign. The aim of this session is to give you a personal view as to why the deficit is proving such an intractable problem, with particular reference to the government's difficulty in raising revenue from taxation. So let's give ourselves a little bit of perspective on this. If you look at the graph, you'll see that this government, and indeed all the governments over the last 25 years, have been spending significantly beyond their means for nearly every one of those years. Apart from this brief period here, just reflect for a moment where your business would be if you'd had negative cash flow like that for a quarter of a century. A few key points to note. Here we see a peak in public spending in the financial crisis of the early 1990s, which the John Major government brings fairly quickly under control through a combination of reducing expenditure and increasing taxation. Of course, 1997, Blair and Brown take over. Nothing changes, which is not surprising because they stuck with the previous Conservative government's taxation policies and indeed the previous Conservative government's spending commitments. So actually by 2000, the deficit was eliminated. We were in fact in surplus and repaying debt. But then look what happens at the start of the second Blair term. Relatively good times we might remember it as, but the public expenditure starts heading up very rapidly and then takes off to an even higher peak when the global economic crisis strikes in 2008. And then we see up here, after the 2010 coalition government comes in, and they start bringing down the public expenditure, although they have to then back off a little bit when it looks like we're going to go into a double-dip recession. But look how flat the taxation line is. To investigate further why that's the case, we need to have a look at where the government actually gets its money from. And this diagram here shows the expected receipts for 15-16 from the Treasury report. A couple of points to highlight. Have a look at the corporation tax here. Just 6% of total revenues. A key priority for the Chancellor in 2010 was cutting the CT rate down to a flat 20%, which by next week he will have achieved. This is the lowest in the G20, and his aim was to make the UK an attractive place to do business in a globally competitive marketplace. The result, however, of the corporation tax rate coming down is that as a proportion of government revenues, corporation tax is only half what it was 25 years ago. And it's not going to change significantly whoever's in government, because even Red Ed is only proposing to put it up to 21%, which is where it is today. VAT, which is one of the big three sources of income for the government, is a very effective tax which is easy to collect, but politically it's difficult increasing the rate. Consequently, the government has become more and more reliant on income tax and national insurance to balance the books. The argument is regularly made that as the economy grows, more people go into employment, the tax receipts will rise. But as you've seen from the graph, this doesn't really seem to be working. And why is that? Well, the first reason is that for a period of about 7 years, wage rises have been below inflation. So in real terms, wages have been falling, which in part has been down to poor productivity. Second reason, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, is that although some of the jobs being created are high skill, around 30% of the jobs created last year were part-time, and many of the other jobs created in the last 5 years have either been low-paid, 0 hours, or on a self-employed basis. So they're not all high-quality, full-time jobs where one might expect a reasonable amount of tax to be paid. And the third reason is that the three traditional political parties have been falling over themselves to increase the personal allowance, taking more and more people out of tax altogether. Indeed, it's regularly cited as the major achievement of the Lib Dems through being in the coalition government. And just look there at the inexorable rise of the personal allowance from 9-10, just before the last general election, through to where it now will be in 17-18 on the basis of the budget proposals. But how much has this cost? Well, watching Danny Alexander on the afternoon of the budget, he said that increasing the personal allowance from 10 to 11,000 will benefit 27 million people. So it may only be £200 per person, but nonetheless that's almost 5.5 billion. But then look at the cost of increasing it over that period we've just seen, from 6,500 to 11,000, cost of around 25 billion. Just to put that in some sort of perspective, back in 2002, Gordon Brown introduced a £10,000 nil rate band of corporation tax. It was intended to help small businesses. It meant that a couple who had a small business could pay one of them a director's salary of 5,000, the other a company secretary salary of 5,000, leave 10,000 of profit in the company, and they could earn £20,000 tax-free. At the time, that seemed to us accountants to be too good to be true. There was a massive rush to incorporate every small business. The idea that a self-employed plumber or taxi driver could earn £20,000 and pay no tax seemed absolutely incredible. The government acted fairly quickly to shut down the opportunity, and the nil rate ban for companies was quietly dropped. But wind forward 10 years or so, and the same small business run by a couple will be able to earn £22,000 completely tax-free. Now, if that was a disaster in 2002, it now seems to be a good idea, not just for small businesses, but for every couple. So how much tax does the average hard-working family actually pay? Let's look at a typical family: 2 working parents and 2 children. The father works full-time and earns £26,000, around average earnings, while the other father works part-time, earning £11,000. So how much tax does the family pay? Well, on those 2 salaries, with personal allowance at £11,000, the higher earner will pay £3,000 in income tax. But of that, they'll get back £1,789 in child benefit and £545 in tax credits. So the net income tax is £666. Now, I know there will be some national insurance payable on those salaries, but for the purposes of this exercise, let's assume that that does what it says on the tin. It actually goes to provide a state pension and various other out-of-work benefits for the payers. Yes, there'll also be some VAT and excise duty on fuel and alcohol and so on, which the family might pay, perhaps £1,500 in the year. That leaves a net tax payment of just over £2,000. Now, does anyone in the room know what a primary school place, state primary school place, costs the government? It's actually, thank you, it's actually around about £3,000, okay? So 2 young children, putting those through state primary school is going to cost the state £6,000. So as you can see, the tax that the family is paying is some way short of even paying the cost of their own children's education. So who's going to pay for the welfare, the defence, the foreign aid, and of course the blessed health service? The answer, of course, is people on above average earnings, who are far fewer in number than those on below average earnings. Hence, the government is depending on more and more on squeezing a relatively small number of high earners. So have a look at this. Income tax, 27% of it is paid by the top 1% of earners. These are presumably the millionaires who you keep hearing about in the expression tax cut for millionaires. 59% of income tax is paid by the top 10% of the working population. And the lower half numerically, in terms of earnings, of the working population pay less than 10% of the tax. So this part here is the so-called squeezed middle. Squeezed middle insofar as they've been paying more and more 40% tax on a greater and greater proportion of their income. They've had perhaps their child benefit taken back off them over the last couple of years, and so on. So bearing in mind all of that, can you believe any of the pitches that are being made to you this May? Or do you perhaps think you're just being told what you want to hear? But what would you do if you were Chancellor? If you were trying to run for the office, would you say that you're going to cut public expenditure and be characterised as a dangerous threat to the NHS who will take us back to the 1930s and who won't be electable? Or will you say that you'll increase taxes? But which ones? There's no easy place to go with that either. Or do you say, keep on borrowing and be characterised as irresponsible? About your only options are to either vaguely hope that economic growth will somehow sort it out, or your other get out of jail card is tackling the tax gap. And to be fair, this government has done a significantly better job than the previous government of tackling evasion and aggressive tax avoidance. Everyone can agree that this is a good thing, and certainly the government has reduced from the demand side the appetite for aggressive tax avoidance. But is this going to be sufficient to pay for doubling of the personal allowance? I rather doubt it. Thank you.